Hi friends, this is Marilyn from tarotclarity.com again, and this is the next installment of the video series that I'm doing, connecting the number of the pip cards to the corresponding numbered card of the major arcana. Sometimes there seems to be a very clear and connect relationship between the number and the major arcana card, and sometimes I think at least it's a bit of a stretch. In order to keep things interesting for myself and for you, I've been mixing up the decks that I've been using on these videos. And I'm using 3 decks today that might be a little bit different from typical ones that might be seen on videos on the Tarot of Marseille. And so I just want to identify them. And when I say Tarot of Marseille, I also, I'm referencing Tarot of Milan. I always like to include at least one Italian deck because that's where they came from. And this particular Italian deck is from the 1600s, probably early to mid. And it's the Tarocchi Fine Dalla Torre out of Bologna or Bologna. The second deck that I've used is the Tarot de Paris. It's also a contemporary around the same period of time. I'm not sure which one is earlier, probably the Italian, but I wouldn't bet my life on it. You can see with this Tarot of Paris that you see it retains a bit of the Mamluk influences in the style of card. It predates the Tarot of Marseille, but it is the first deck that kind of, resembles what was coming out of Italy and then, would eventually become TDM from France. And so I think it's a significant deck. And as I said, it's out of, it's probably the early to mid 1600s out of Paris. And then we have the Tarot of Madenié, or the Pierre Madenié Tarot from 1709. And most people, believe that this is the first well-established style of Marseille out of Marseille itself. So there we have it. I'd like to, before I even talk about the number 5 and any references to what number 5 could mean, I kind of would like to comment on the distribution of the objects in these 3 decks. Another thing is that I've limited now to just 3 decks so that it's a little easier to see the pictures. I was using so many decks before, I don't know if you ever actually were able to see any of the cards that well. We noticed that in the 2 French decks that the 5 coins are distributed rather the same on the card, different embellishments, but the distribution, the way they lay is the same. And the Italian deck has quite a different configuration. But when we get to the batons, we have more similarity between the Madenié deck and the deck out of Bologna than we do with what we have out of Paris. Then we get back to the cups. We have a similar distribution between the 5 cups of the Madenié and the 5 cups of the Paris deck. And once again, the 5 is distributed as, differently than the other, that the Italian cups are distributed differently as they were with the 5 coins. So here, the Italian deck is the odd man out as far as the distribution of how the objects appear. Then again, with the swords, we have a similarity between the Italian deck and the Madenié out of Marseille. Although in the Italian deck, it appears as though the sword is intended to be down, and in the Madenié, it appears that the sword is intended to be up, to be in the upright position. And again, we have the Mamluk reference or influence to the swords. It doesn't seem to resemble either the Italian or the French that came later. And then as far as the Pope goes, we have some interesting things to comment on. You don't typically see the stigmata on the hands of the Pope in tarot decks, but in these 2 particular decks we do. In the 3rd deck, we don't see the stigmata per se, but we do see of a style of a crucifix on the hands in the position where the stigmata would be. Apparently, they're on gloves, so that's kind of interesting. You don't see the stigmata corresponding to the feet, however, in any of them. Another thing is, it's only in the Pope of the Madenié where I really get a sense that he's clearly standing. He seems like he's standing at a pulpit, you know. If you've ever been to churches in Europe from the Middle Ages or even from the Renaissance, there was always, you know, like a pulpit where the bishop or the priest or whoever would walk up a flight of stairs, you know, like like a ramp of stairs to be able to look down upon his congregation, and that's what this appears to be. Also, in this particular deck, it's the first time that we see a major arcana card appear with two other characters. You know, you in the Fool we have, okay, maybe there's a dog, but or cat or something, but there's no other human involved. With the Magician, there's no other human. With the Popess, there's no other human. With the the Empress, there's no other human. With the Emperor, there's no other human. And then we get to the Pope, and bam, with the Tarot of Marseille, we see him appear with two other individuals. Right? Now, these two are earlier than the Tarot of Marseille, and we don't see two additional individuals, although we do see some kind of strange-looking female sphinx. You know, I don't really know what that's referencing. I don't know as much about the Tarot of Paris, and maybe someday I'll do a video when I learn more about it and its symbolism. But it's a very curious deck, and I do like using it. And as I use it and I have questions, that's how I research it, and then I'll know for the next time. So let's take a look at what the number 5 means to humans. Now, we can always think of numbers as they relate to us as modern humans, so far removed from the experience of medieval and Renaissance Italy, which is where they came from. But we also have to look at them in the context of where they came from. You know, I'm not a Christian person, you know, but I read tarot cards, and there's no rewriting history. Tarot came from a Western European Catholic tradition, and their references are the references that we have for trying to understand what was in their heads and what these numbers and what these suits and what these characters meant to them. So let's take a look at what number 5 might mean to the medieval or Renaissance Western European individual. We do know that there are some references to, the Christian Judeo tradition. We know that David had 5 pebbles when he killed Goliath. We know that there's 5 books of the Torre, or the Book of Moses. We do know that, what else? I'm looking at my notes. We do know that the 1400s, when the tarot surfaced, was a time of exploration. In fact, the fact that card games came to Italy at all bears out that point. If the cards came from points east, they certainly arrived to Western Europe via probably soldiers or people who had reason to travel or explore from one part of the continent to another, and very clearly the deck of cards originated someplace else. Now, Italy made tarot what it is. They, and that's a history lesson all unto itself. The Italians took a game that came from someplace else and embellished it with their own 2 cents, But let's not forget that it did come from other points, and it was as a result of exploration and science. And so there was definitely an understanding of mathematics. There was a dude named, what was his name? Fibonacci. Although Fibonacci, the term Fibonacci numbers takes credit, an Italian, claims credit for the understanding of a Fibonacci sequence. It was really understood and discovered by Indians from India who recognized this significance of this sequence of numbers 1,000 years before Fibonacci, but Fibonacci made it famous. And the number 5, and what I'm trying to say, has some significant mathematical qualities that are above my pay grade. I'm not a mathematician. I think of number 5 more in terms of human context, but it is interesting to know that 5 has, lots of mystical significance as far as the world of mathematics goes. And so I don't want to dismiss that aspect. In layman's terms, I can touch base on that a little bit, in ways that I understand it to explain it. The Fibonacci sequence is a sequence of numbers, generally inspired by what we can observe in nature. A lot of times we'll refer to it as the golden ratio, as we can evidence in things like pine cones, sunflowers, patterns created by a sequence of relationship between numbers, I think it's 1.618 something. You can see it in the Nautilus seashell. The number 5 is the only prime number. That's the sum of 2 consecutive primes. It's the 5th Fibonacci number, and when you add the 2 numbers before it that are consecutive, it actually results in its position in the Fibonacci sequence, which is number 5, which is kind of interesting. In modern human terms, when we think of the most destructive category of a hurricane or tornado, we classify it as a number 5. We have 5 senses. We have hearing, seeing, smelling, touching. Let me see, what are they? I wrote them down. Speaking, hearing, seeing, tasting, and feeling. We have 5 basic tastes. We have sweet, salty, sour, bitter, and, a taste for savory or fermented type of food products. Some cultures, maybe not necessarily the Judeo-Christian tradition. However, we don't live in a vacuum, and we do borrow and take things from each other. There are, in many cultures, 5 virtues and 5 practices. They might not all be the same across the board, but, 5 virtues that if you live, your life every day, practicing these virtues, you get closer to God. For example, truth, compassion, contentment, humility, love, or, sincerity, earnestness, kindness. I know that the Hamsa is a peace symbol that's universally accepted, in the Middle East by both Jews and Muslims. What else? I know that there's 5 books of the Torre, or the 5 books of Moses. I may have mentioned that already. I'm not sure. The 5-pointed star is significant across numerous faiths, and it could be, represent different features of each of their faiths. They have the 5-pointed star in common, even if the points don't reference the same 5 points. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, we have the 5 wounds of Jesus. We have, what do we have? We have, getting back to the scientific world, when they were trying to categorize what the universe consisted of. We had the 4 elements that we mentioned with the number 4, such as air, water, fire, and earth, but we also had the additional feature, a part of the universe, like the ether world or the spiritual world. And you can't get back, can't get past the 5 being a very human number, being a number of, I mentioned our 5 senses. We have 4 limbs and a head. And of our 4 limbs, they each have 5 additional appendages. Is that what we would say? And, in our creative world, there's the staff of music has 5 lines. Even in modern days, the Olympic rings are 5, which represent the 5 colors that modern humans have in common in their flag. So even though it's not something from the context of Western Europe back in the 1400s, it's still in keeping with the number 5 being a very human number. I wrote down a few things as they came to me, and I'm just peeking at my notes because I don't want to forget anything. This is kind of interesting. The Roman numeral 5 stands for the planet Jupiter. And in some decks, you may be familiar where, in the Swiss decks, where it was politically incorrect to have the Pope and the Popess appear in a deck of cards. They replaced them with Juno and Jupiter. And Jupiter replaced the number 5 card, which I think is very interesting. Most amphibians, reptiles, and mammals, as I mentioned, we do, have 5 appendages on each of their extremities. Blah, blah. So I think I've touched base. Coco Chanel, no matter what you think of her, her lucky number was 5, and it's the name of her signature fragrance. David had 5 pebbles when he killed Goliath. And I think I got them all. So there we have it. So we have the number 5 being a very human, relatable number. Okay? So now let's think in terms of, the sun is shifting. I'm going to walk around to the other side. I didn't want to cast a shadow on the cards. So let's think of the number 5 in human terms as it relates to each of the 4 suits. So we have the suit of coins, which is a very practical suit. It's the suit that represents earth, or whichever quality you apply to it. In my case, I accept the tradition of coins representing the material world. So we have 5 coins in a human world. Well, it depends on all the other cards that are involved. I never read cards in isolation. I always read them in relation to the cards around it, and also, to the question. But if I were to give like a keyword for 5 coins, it would be, maybe an unstable number when it comes to the application of money. 4 is a very, very stable number. And the next number 5 is, it's not like having a 3rd wheel, but it's maybe like having a 5th wheel, 5 can go either way. 5 could be a number of abundance if it's in a sequence where the numbers are increasing, or it could be a number in decline or a lack of stability, especially if it appears in sequence in descending order. Now let's look at the 5 of batons. If you accept that the batons is the suit of energy and creative output, it could be a time of unrest, If you keep thinking of 5 as a number of experience, human experience, you can think of the 5 batons as maybe a number of conflict, or again, as a number of things coming together, depending on the other cards in the spread and the order of, ascending or descending order of the cards. 5 cups, okay? same kind of thing. Is there an imbalance emotionally in some area of the querent's life? Is there an overabundance? It depends on if the numbers are ascending or descending and what the question is. I'd rather have 5 cups of wine and 5 friends and 5 tight relationships and, maybe 3 dozen acquaintances that I barely know. I might rather have a meeting of 5 people than a meeting with 300. So everything is really in context. 5 could represent, if you consider that cups might be of water or emotion, or the poetic and, in some regards, spiritual world. 5 can be a number of showing some type of imbalance or growth. Again, it really all just depends on the other numbers around it. And same with the swords. Now, swords, it's really hard to look at swords and not think in terms of aggression or action. You can think in terms of communication because you have to be very quick-witted if you're a swordsman, especially if you're fencing. You have to be very sharp, excuse the pun, but you do. And so the suit of air can take on those qualities. 5 is halfway between 1 and 10. And so it's not in some ways it's a good solid number because you're halfway there, but you're also halfway not there. And it's one number, it's the number between 2 perfect numbers, 4 and 6. 4 and 6 are good, stable, harmonic numbers. 5 is a number that's kind of like the odd man out. There's no mate to it, it's like, there is an odd man out. And so I guess for that reason, I usually will equate number 5 with a little bit of instability. And when you think in terms of our 5 senses, you can have a witness that swears up and down they saw something with their 5 senses. And sometimes those witnesses are really wrong because you can't always trust your 5 senses. So when I say that 5 is a human number, it includes our fallibility, because we're not infallible. So now speaking of fallibility, now let's take a look at the Pope, who is the major arcana's answer to the number 5. And I did touch base on a few things, that this was the first card, especially in TDM, where there are 2 individuals beside the Pope himself. And here he does appear to be standing. And in these 2 decks, it's a little confusing in this middle deck. So I don't know if he's standing or seated. But here, the Pope clearly does appear to be seated. And getting back to the idea of infallibility, I think it's very interesting that the number 5 was applied to the Pope because I forgot to mention this when we were talking about numbers. The Pythagoreans thought of 5 as the number which was a marriage between heaven and earth. And many spiritual leaders are thought to be the... Gosh, I'm sorry about this shadow. I've been here so long that the shadow has taken over. Let me see if I can correct that. Well, I think I've improved upon it for a few minutes anyway. I don't know how long the shadow will stay away. But at any rate, the Pythagoreans did think of the number 5 as because it's a mid number. It's the number between 1 and 10. It's the center number. So it's the midway between heaven and earth. And it's interesting because our spiritual leaders, we often think of them across the board as being the emissary between God and humans, right? The Pope is considered to be infallible. He's next to God, as were the pharaohs. There was a direct connection between the spiritual leaders and the God of the deity. of the culture. So I think it's also very interesting that 5 was applied to the Pope. When we think of the emperor, who is a secular leader, the Pope is a spiritual one. And in the Pope, we have a higher level of trust. With the emperor, we trust the emperor. We trust the emperor will do the right thing for the masses. But with the Pope, we hope that or we trust that the Pope or the spiritual leader will do what is in the individual's best interest, that you'll be guided with the best possible advice and confidentiality. Now, that's where this figure was born from. That's what the ideal of a pope represented. I have no ill feelings about our current pope, except that the institution he represents has a lot of corruption, as do, let's face it, most of our male dominated social constructs. And I'm not a man hater. I have 2 sons, I have 2 brothers, I had a father, I've had 2 husbands. I love men. But let's not forget that when there are men almost exclusively in a environment or a situation, it often doesn't end well for others. So with that in mind, we'll move on. But the Pope having the understanding, ideally, that the Pope would have been a leader that we could trust with our most private needs, spiritual needs. And along with that, we gave him a sense of infallibility in his guidance, in a spiritual as well as psychological significance. We often would be obedient to him. When we see the Pope in a spread, it might, what it represents ideally is being able to turn to someone, having someone, or there being a person or an individual or an entity in your life that you can turn to depend upon for your spiritual and well-being. And I know that for some of us, it's really hard to grasp that in terms of the Pope and the hierarchy of the church. But we have to divorce ourselves from what it is today and think of, in bigger terms, what the ideal representation of the Pope is. We don't necessarily have to subscribe, I certainly don't, to a Catholic hierarchy of male dominance in the clergy. It's the concept from where it was born that is the signification that we're looking for. Let's see. Another interesting point is Western popes didn't generally wear beards. We only have one bearded pope here. I don't know rightly what's going on in this pope, the Pope of Paris, excuse me, the Tarot of Paris, but we clearly see a beard on this guy from Marseille. And this Pope, I skipped through him when I was looking for the Pope in the deck originally. I skipped through him thinking he was the Popess, because he has a decidedly feminine look about him. So I almost didn't even recognize this one as the Pope, actually. So he's clearly clean shaven. I get the idea that bearded popes was a curious feature, since Western popes were not bearded in periods after the 1200s. Beards are more of a Mid-Eastern characteristic. And so this is either influenced, this pope here is either influenced by what was coming out of the Mideast, Or if you consider the only time it was appropriate for Western cultured priests after the 1200s to have a beard was as a temporary device, as a sign of mourning uh, following the sack of Rome. There's a lack of consistency, if you notice, regarding the staff. Some of them have a staff like this. Some of them don't. We have a staff, but it's a little different. This one has a crucifix. Here, there does appear to be a staff. I'm not sure what's on it here. But he also has keys, which is kind of curious. I think the keys would be referencing Rome, the keys to Rome. And the lack of keys in these cards might reference a greater scope above and beyond Rome, a greater range. I think that's all I've got for connecting the number 5 with the major arcana card. I'm not really sure if there's a huge connection between the number 5 and the Pope. Other than the point of making that 5 is the number between 1 and 10, and the Pope is considered to be the connector between the heavens and the earths. I think of 5 as a very fallible number, whereas traditionally we would think of the Pope as being infallible. So that's kind of an interesting contradiction right there. The Pope with number 5, I don't know if I would make a real close connection between the Pope and the number 5, other than making the connection with it being, a halfway point between the heavens and the earth. I think in terms of number 5 more as being kind of a fallible number, a number of human sensory, and we all know that human senses are fallible, whereas the Pope ideally is infallible. So, I'm not sure what you would make of that. As always, I hope you enjoyed this particular video. You can find me on Instagram as The Tarot Reader. You can find me here as Marilyn from Tarot Clarity. And, to request a reading or to read my blog, I have a lot of stuff on my blog. You can find me at tarotclarity.com. Until next time, peace. Sorry about the shadow.